Mumbai's survival is an engineering anomaly. While most global megacities expanded in radial circles, Mumbai was forced into a linear verticality by the ocean. This city does not run on its roads, its bridges, nor its metro. It runs on a 19th century rail footprint designed for steam and cotton. To understand the Mumbai local is to understand how a series of colonial reclamation projects and industrial shifts locked the city into a permanent north-south commute that cannot be altered. This is the chronological history of the infrastructure that built a city where there was no land. The origin of the Mumbai Suburban Railway is not found in a station, but in the sea. In 1661, when the British Crown acquired the territory from the Portuguese as part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza, the city, as we know it, did not exist. Instead, the region was an archipelago of 7 fragmented islands. These were the islands of Colaba, Old Woman's Island, Bombay, Mazagan, Parel, Worli, and Mahim. Between these landmasses lay treacherous marshy creeks and vast mudflats that were submerged during every high tide. This fragmented geography made any form of overland transport an absolute impossibility. The only way to move between these points was by boat, navigating the natural harbors and dangerous tidal currents. The British East India Company realized that for Bombay to become a commercial powerhouse, the sea had to be pushed back. Between 1784 and 1845, the geography of the region was forcibly altered through a series of massive civil engineering projects that would eventually provide the foundation for the railway tracks. The most critical intervention was the Hornby-Vellard project, initiated by Governor William Hornby. This project involved the construction of a massive reinforced seawall designed to block the Great Breach between Worli and Malabar Hill. By damming the creeks, the British successfully drained the salt marshes and started the process of merging the islands into a single unified landmass. However, it is crucial to understand that this reclamation was not intended for residential sprawl or urban planning. It was a strategic move designed to protect the Bombay port and consolidate the dockyards. Following the Hornby-Vellard, other major projects like the Colaba Causeway in 1838 stitched the southern islands together. The resulting landmass was a long, thin, and extremely narrow peninsula. This physical constraint is the single most important factor in the history of the local trains. Because the city was built on this narrow strip of reclaimed land, there was simply no space for a diversified, wide-reaching road network. The north-south orientation of the city's life was settled before the first rail was ever laid. When the railway companies arrived in the 1850s, they had no choice but to lay their tracks along the only solid land available, which was the central spine of the newly unified islands. The formal history of the railway began on the afternoon of April 16, 1853. At exactly 3:35 p.m., the Great Indian Peninsula Railway, or the GIPR, operated the first commercial passenger train in the history of India. This initial journey consisted of 14 carriages pulled by 3 legendary steam locomotives named the Sahib, the Sultan, and the Sindh. Briefly, they carried 400 invited guests across 21 miles, or 34 kilometers, from the Bori Bunder station to Thane. While history books often remember this as a milestone for passenger travel, the data reveals a different primary motive. This was a strategic freight and administrative corridor. The British were not looking to move the public. They were looking to connect the deep-water Bombay port to the cotton-growing regions of the Deccan Plateau. For the first decade of operation, from 1853 to 1863, the concept of a suburban service was non-existent. There were no daily commuters and no season passes. The stations along the route were mere technical halts where steam engines could cool down or take on water. However, the infrastructure expansion moved with aggressive speed. By 1854, the line had already been extended from Thane to Kalia, which required the construction of the first major railway bridge over the Thane Creek. By 1858, the GIPR was pushing further toward the base of the Sahyadri Mountains. Simultaneously, A rival company known as the Bombay, Baroda and Central India Railway, or the BB&CI, was completing its own line from Surat. This line terminated at a temporary wooden station in the Back Bay area. It was the BB&CI that eventually introduced the first officially recorded suburban service in 1867. This service consisted of just one train per day running from Virar to Back Bay. This 1867 service marks the true birth of the Mumbai local. It was a direct response to a massive population surge. By 1864, Mumbai's population had reached nearly 800,000 people. The southern districts were becoming dangerously overcrowded, and the railway became the only tool capable of allowing the middle-tier clerks and merchants to live in northern suburbs while continuing to work in the southern fort area. The transition of Mumbai from a colonial trading outpost to a global industrial powerhouse was triggered by a conflict thousands of miles away. The American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, resulted in a Union blockade of Confederate ports. This blockade halted the supply of American cotton to the British textile mills in Lancashire. Suddenly, the British Empire turned its entire focus to Bombay as its primary source of raw cotton. This created an unprecedented economic boom known as share mania. The massive influx of capital was used for further land reclamation and, more importantly, the construction of massive textile mills. The areas of mills became the new industrial heart of India. This industrialization changed the railway forever. The mills required a labor force of hundreds of thousands of people. As the land in Parel became occupied by factories, the workers were forced to move further north. Unlike the dock workers of the previous era, the mill workers operated on extremely rigid 12-hour shifts, which created the necessity for a reliable, high-volume transport system that could deliver thousands of people to their factory gates at the exact same time every day. This was the moment the peak hour was born. The GIPR and the BB&CI had to increase their frequency of short-distance trains to match these shift timings. Stations like Parel and Curry Road, which were once quiet outposts, evolved into massive transit hubs for a blue-collar workforce. By the 1880s, the railway was no longer just a tool for the British administration. It was the lifeblood of the city's labor economy. To manage the astronomical volume of passengers and freight, the city needed monumental terminals. In 1878, the construction of Victoria Terminus began on the site of the old Bori Bunder station. Architect Frederick William Stevens designed the building in a high Victorian Gothic style, but it was much more than just a beautiful facade. It was the most technologically advanced rail terminal in all of Asia at the time of its completion in 1888. The building of Victoria Terminus was a symbolic statement that Mumbai had become the urbs prima in Indies, or the first city of India. While the GIPR was building its monument in the east, the BB&CI established its definitive headquarters at Churchgate in the west. These two terminals became the anchors of the city. They dictated the entire flow of Mumbai's daily life. Every morning, the tide of humanity flowed south towards these 2 points, and every evening it retreated north. This established a permanent pendulum movement of people that has remained unchanged for a century. The terminals did not just serve the trains, they defined the geography of the business districts. Because the tracks ended at Churchgate and Victoria Terminus, the offices, courts, and banks were all built within walking distance of these stations, locking the city's economic center to the southern tip of the peninsula. As the 20th century dawned, the two-line system managed by the GIPR and the BB&CI was already facing a crisis of saturation. The city's population had exceeded 900,000 by the year 1000, and the existing tracks were struggling to balance long-distance mail trains with the growing demand for local transit. However, there was a massive geographical gap in the network. The eastern waterfront of the island, which consisted largely of underdeveloped salt pans, mangroves, and the newly expanding docks, was completely disconnected from the rail spine. The conceptualization of the harbor line was a strategic response to the needs of the Bombay Port Trust. In the early 1900s, the British administration realized that the Central and Western lines could not handle the projected freight from the massive Alexandra dock which was under construction. Unlike the Western and Central lines, the Harbor Line was not initially designed to serve residential suburbs. It was an industrial and logistics corridor meant to move goods and port labor. The construction was a grueling engineering task. In 1910, the line was opened for traffic between Kurla and Ray Road, but the real challenge was connecting this eastern branch to the main terminal at Victoria Terminus. This required the construction of a high-level masonry viaduct at Sandhurst Road. This was a revolutionary piece of infrastructure. It created India's first truly multi-level railway station. While the Central Line trains ran at the ground level, the Harbor Line tracks were elevated on a massive stone and steel structure to navigate the dense urban clutter of the docklands. When the extension was finally completed in 1925, it successfully linked the eastern suburbs to the heart of the city, establishing the tripartite rail structure that survives to this day. The single most important technological leap in the history of Mumbai took place on February 3, 1925. On that historic February day, the GIPR inaugurated India's first electric train service. It ran on the Harbor Line from Victoria Terminus to Kurla, utilizing a 1500-volt direct current or DC overhead traction system. This was not a minor upgrade. It was a total reimagining of mass transit. The introduction of electric multiple units, known as EMUs, changed the physics of the commute. Because these trains had traction motors distributed across multiple coaches rather than a single engine at the front, they could accelerate and decelerate almost instantly. This technological shift reduced time between two consecutive trains from 20 minutes down to just 5 or 6 minutes. Following the success of the GIPR, the BBCI on the western side electrified its tracks from Colaba to Borivali. For the first time, it was physically and mathematically possible for a middle-class office worker to live 40 kilometers away in the outskirts and still reach the southern business district in under an hour. The habitable radius of Mumbai effectively tripled in a single decade because of this power transition. The momentum of the 1920s was abruptly halted by the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. Mumbai, due to its strategic deep-water harbor, became the primary logistics and military hub for the Allied forces in South Asia. This period saw the railway system pushed to its absolute breaking point. The government commandeered the tracks for military specials, which were trains carrying troops, tanks, and ammunition directly to the docks for shipment to the African and European fronts. Because of the war, all imports of new railway parts, steel, and rolling stock from Great Britain were halted. The local trains were forced to run for 6 years without proper maintenance or upgrades. Meanwhile, the population of the city continued to climb as war-related industries drew in thousands of new migrants. By the time India achieved independence in 1947, the Mumbai Suburban Railway was an exhausted, battered system. It was carrying double the passengers it was designed for, using aging trains that had been overused and under-maintained during the war years. The partition of India further exacerbated this as a massive influx of refugees settled in the northern peripheral areas, creating new, unplanned demand on a rail network that was already failing. In the 1950s and 1960s, the newly independent Indian government took a monumental step by nationalizing the colonial railway companies. The Great Indian Peninsula Railway was integrated into the Central Railway Zone, and the BBCI was renamed the Western Railway. This was a fundamental shift in the logic of the local trains. They were no longer profit-seeking colonial utilities. They became a subsidized public service intended to support the working-class citizens of a new nation. The government made a conscious decision to keep season ticket fares extremely low. This ensured that even the most low-income laborer could afford the daily commute from the far north to the industrial south. While this was a social necessity, it created a permanent economic dependency. Because the trains were so cheap, the population became permanently tethered to the rail lines. During this same period, Mumbai's unique geography prevented the development of a massive road network. By the 1960s, it was officially recognized that the local trains were not just a part of the city, they were the only functional backbone that kept the entire metropolis from collapsing. The 1970s and 1980s represent a period of structural stagnation that led to the modern-day crisis of overcrowding. As skyscrapers rose in South Mumbai and industrial estates expanded in Thane and Kalyan, the demand for rail travel exploded. However, because the city had allowed buildings and slums to be constructed right up to the edge of the railway property, it became impossible to widen the corridors. To handle this, the railways began a massive logistical project to extend platforms across the city. The transition from 9-car trains to 12-car trains required every single station to be physically lengthened, a process that took years of overnight engineering. In 1992, the world's first ladies' special trains were introduced on the Western Line to accommodate the growing number of women entering the workforce. Yet even with these additions, the system remained a north-south prisoner. The failure of planners to build east-west rail connectors meant that millions of commuters were forced to take massive detours through junctions, further concentrating the crowds at specific choke points that remain the most dangerous parts of the commute today. The final major historical hurdle in this timeline was the transition from the old DC power system to the modern AC system. For nearly 90 years, Mumbai's trains had run on 1500-volt direct current. This system was energy inefficient and could not support the high-speed, air-conditioned coaches required for a 21st century city. Between 2012 and 2016, in a series of highly coordinated overnight operations, the entire Mumbai suburban network was converted to 25,000-volt alternating current, or AC. This was a massive undertaking that involved changing every overhead wire, transformer, and substation while the city slept, ensuring that the morning commute was never interrupted. This conversion allowed for the introduction of modern stainless steel rakes and eventually the first fully air-conditioned local trains. The history of the Mumbai local is the history of the city itself. It is a story of how a 19th century engineering project designed for British administrative control and cotton exports became the only thing preventing a modern megacity of 20 million people from grinding to a halt. The system is unique and irrepressible because no other city in the world is so completely dependent on a single linear rail spine. While other cities can build new roads or expand in circles, Mumbai remains a prisoner of the geography created by the Seven Islands and the British reclamation projects. The local train is more than just transport. It is a geographic necessity. It is the result of the draining of marshes in the 1780s, the industrial boom of the 1860s, and the electrification of the 1920s. Every day, as 8 million people board these trains, they are traveling on a path that was locked into the earth over 150 years ago.